We're here today to continue our committee's work securing our critical mineral supply chains and countering the People's Republic of China's control over so many of the materials which have become essential to our modern lives. Just after the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law and on the heels of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, this committee held a series of hearings on critical minerals in early 2022. We recognize the growing risk of our country's reliance on nations who do not share our values for minerals. Just like Putin weaponized Russia's oil and gas resources to try to scare off Europe from supporting Ukraine, Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party are more than willing to use critical minerals as leverage to put Americans and the free world at risk. In fact, China is already doing so. Just last month, Xi Jinping's government announced export restrictions on gallium and germanium, two critical minerals that are needed for semiconductor fabrication. This is just a small preview of what could come in the future, and some of the decisions that the administration has been making seems to be increasing our risk instead of reducing it. That is why it is so important for Congress has made progress to strengthen supply chains and onshore vital manufacturing, including through the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, CHIPS and Science and National Defense Authorization Acts. However, our work is still not done. I want to thank my dear friend Dan Yergin, who I'm grateful to have testifying before us today, will help us better understand how the global landscape for critical minerals has changed in the wake of those legislative efforts. Dr. Yergin and his team have done extensive study of the supply and demand outlook for copper, lithium, cobalt, and nickel, including a focus on opportunities to produce these resources domestically, as well as with our free trade partners. It will come as no surprise that I want to discuss our best options to pivot away from China, particularly when it comes to the electric vehicle supply chain. Let me be clear. I fully support realistic and responsible approaches to reducing emissions in the transportation sector, and EVs are an important part of that equation. But so long as China and other countries who don't share our values control the supply of critical minerals required for EVs, I will strongly oppose moving too quickly toward an EV-dominated future. Thanks to innovation and investment in our domestic oil industry over the last 2 decades, there is no longer a risk that foreign adversaries could force us to ration gasoline like we saw in the 70s. We must deploy the same innovative spirit and entrepreneurship to ensure that no American has to wait in line for the ration of Chinese battery. The chart behind me shows just how dire the threat is. Which one we have up? When it comes to EV battery supply chain, depending on the mineral, China and Chinese-controlled entities and countries like Indonesia process anywhere from 60 to 100% of all the minerals needed for batteries and electric motors. And their dominance is not just in minerals, it's also in battery manufacturing. China is responsible for 74% of the world's cathode production, 92% of anode production, and 76% of lithium-ion battery cell production. They simply have cornered the market. With numbers like these, it is frustrating that the administration continues to try to water down the sourcing requirements for EV batteries clearly stated, and I say clearly stated because we wrote it out in the IRA. This is what the administration is administering to try to get more out quicker and be more dependent on China than we already are. They're reducing. In 2023, the bill stated you had to have 40% from the U.S. or free trade countries. They cut that down to 20, in half. Again, in 2024, it goes to 50. They kept that at 20. 2025, 60. They kept that at 30. 26, cut it in half from 70 to 35. You can see the trend. This is what you hear me complain about all the time. They're trying to administer a piece of legislation they never passed. And I'm just waiting for them to get out of the, what do we have? What are they in right now? What cycle? The interim. Huh? Yeah, they're an interim as far as they haven't filed the final rules. They're operating under the interim right now because we can't sue them. As soon as they go into their final ruling, there will be somebody damaged. They can sue. We'll do an amicus brief and stop this craziness. This is what I'm dealing with. So when people say, why are you upset about your bill? The bill is well balanced. We're producing more energy than ever before. We're producing more energy in this country than ever before. And we can do the same with minerals that we haven't even touched yet. So with numbers like these, it's frustrating that the administration continues to try to water down the sourcing requirements for EV batteries, clearly stated in the IRA. Through guidance, the administration is attempting to cut the critical mineral sourcing percentage requirements in half, as we just showed you, pretending battery component manufacturing is the same as critical minerals processing, and proposing fake free trade agreements that circumvent the law. And the administration still has not published a foreign entity of concern, guidance required to in the IRA to prevent bad actors from receiving taxpayer dollars. The chart, as we said, a stark difference behind me was between the strong critical mineral sourcing requirements explicitly spelled out in Section 13401 of the IRA and Treasury's attempt to lower the bar through guidance. As you can see, Treasury is effectively cutting the requirements in half, making it harder to secure the supply chain here at home and with our partners. The administration appears to care more about getting EVs on the road than our energy security and competition with China. With so many of our mineral resources on federal lands, I appreciate Deputy Secretary Boudreaux joining us to discuss the Interior Department's role as part of the solution. While Congress has given the administration tools to secure our supply chain in recent legislation, I'm incredibly frustrated that the bipartisan demand for urgency seems to be going unheard. Benchmark mineral intelligence estimates that at least 336 new mines are needed for graphite, lithium, nickel, and cobalt to meet EV demands prior to 2035. However, an insufficient number of new mines are currently in development to meet that demand, while those projects that are under development face long time frames and considerable risk. When we refuse to allow mining and processing here in timely fashion, we encourage it to occur in countries with lower environmental and labor standards than we were permitted at home. No one in the administration or Congress denies this reality. Personally, I've been speaking to members in the Congo who are basically being exploited, and they are desperately in need of changing how they do business there, and China having a stranglehold on them. And they're willing to fight, but it's going to be very hard. But we haven't seen any major projects approved by the U.S. Forest Service or the Department of Interior at any point during this administration. What we have seen is environmental impact statements for mineral projects rescinded to undergo years of additional review and consultation with no end in sight. Other projects, including one that has received Defense Production Act funding so that the Department of Defense can manufacture desperately needed ammunition, have seen their schedules slip over and over again. And we've heard troubling reports that Department of Energy grant funding is being withheld for mineral processing that would enable new mining, while recycling projects already have their cash in hand. Not only has the administration delayed the minerals projects that we need, they appear to be taking the position that we don't have a permitting problem at all for critical minerals. The bipartisan infrastructure law directed the Department of Interior to make critical mineral permitting improvements and then report back to Congress within 1 year on progress and additional recommendations. But instead of getting the report, the law requires the report we received earlier this month, 10 months late, does not describe any concrete actions that have been taken to speed up permitting or establishing timelines as required by the bipartisan infrastructure law. While I do not support the intent of some of the administration's non-permitting recommendations, like reasonable reforms to the mining law of 1872 to ensure a fair return for taxpayers and addressing abandoned hard rock mines, none of that does anything to secure the supply chains for minerals or for the EV batteries that this administration so desperately wants. It's seeming more and more like this administration's strategy is focused on talking about new mining, but doing very little to actually permit and use resources we have beneath our feet. I'm committed to keep working on a bipartisan basis in our committee to correct this course. We must also acknowledge that while we can provide much of the minerals that we need domestically, we can't produce or process every mineral in the quantities that we need here in the United States, or even just in North America. So we need to ensure that we are working with trusted, reliable partners when it comes to overseas mineral sourcing. That means looking to friends like Canada and Australia, free trade partners, and our NATO allies to help us secure our mineral supply chains. But it does not mean ignoring our democratic values, labor standards, or environmental priorities to buy from anyone willing to sell us minerals or batteries. In closing, if we don't address our dependence problem and look for innovative ways to onshore the critical mineral supply chain, it will compromise our energy security and handicap us in a global marketplace. Let me be very clear. The reason the bill was written the way it was, I didn't want to give 75 cents credit to EVs, to the car makers. I think they have a good product, the market will go. That's where the market will take you. But in order to do that, we made a compromise. If we can develop our own supply chain, not dependent on China and areas of the world that we have no values with whatsoever, that can hold them hostage, the same way that Putin has held energy as a hostage and a weapon, then I would be happy to work with you. I tried in good faith to do that. And we have a bill that we all passed, this law passed. It's a good piece of legislation that they do not wish to adhere to because it's not the time frame that they wanted. That's the problem I've got. So I'm going to continue to fight. And we can't let this happen. And with that in mind, I cannot help but take the opportunity with the Deputy Secretary to bring up the Inflation Reduction Act's oil and gas leasing provisions. I've been concerned about the efforts of the administration to throttle back oil and gas leasing and production. So I made sure that the IRA tied Interior's ability to issue wind and solar leases to the department holding significant oil and gas lease sales, both on and offshore, simply stating, you can't go out and do what you want unless you do everything that we need. We're going to basically be able to extract the oil and gas that we need in the properties and basically our BLM land and offshore basically with the Gulf, and do that as we're basically developing the resources that we need for minerals. As we all know, not only are we nearing the end of the fiscal year on September 30th, we are coming up on two major oil and gas deadlines: the release of the long-delayed 5-year offshore leasing program and the Inflation Reduction Act's final mandate, Gulf of Mexico lease sales 261. Unfortunately, as a result of the administration's own actions, they've managed to delay the lease sale 261 until no later than November 8th, according to a recent Fifth Circuit order. Let me review just how ridiculous this is. First, the administration allowed environmental groups to hijack the leasing process by agreeing to a voluntary settlement related to the Rice's well that bypassed Interior's normal procedure and set them up to lose in court. The settlement imposed new restrictions on oil and gas in the Gulf and would have removed 6 million acres from the lease sale. Then, when the federal judge determined Interior's changes to the lease sale were likely unlawful and ordered the sale to proceed as originally proposed, Interior said they did not have enough time to course correct and meet the September 30 deadline set by Congress. Why not? Because according to Interior, they need more time to follow normal procedures, the same procedures that the administration was willing to bypass to appease environmental activists in the settlement agreement. You can't make this crap up. You just can't. It's real. This is just the latest example in which this administration hasn't gotten the message. Trying to rewrite an energy security law passed by Congress through administration action is not a winning strategy, and they're finding out the hard way, and they're delaying everyone's production. I want everyone to know that I will support anyone who suffers damages as a result of this administration failing to implement the IRA in alignment with the intent and the letter of this very balanced law. Because the reality is, we'll get closer to achieving our shared goals, not Republican goals, not Democrat goals, but American goals for oil and gas, for critical minerals, and for many other energy sources, if we embrace the balanced approach in the IRA. As 10 of my Republican colleagues stated in their amicus brief related to the lease sale 261, and I have said this, that bill that was put together, the IRA, was done with all the consideration, working with my partners on the Republican side and Democrat side for over 5 years. The IRA was the result of that considerable deliberation concerning the economic, energy, environmental, and strategic interests of the United States. And the IRA balances diverse, complex, and overlapping considerations, including growth and conservation, domestic needs, and global positioning, and security and diplomacy. That was what my friends said. I couldn't agree more with my Republican friends on this, and I will continue to do everything in my power to ensure the law is implemented in that manner. We're already on track to realize the benefits of these energy laws that we have recently passed. We are producing, as I've said before, more energy of all kinds in 2023. 37 trillion cubic feet of gas will be produced this year, never before. 4.6 billion barrels of oil from the United States, never that much before. And doubling the amount of solar and battery projects, doubling the amount in 1 year, never done before. If we work on a bipartisan basis to implement all the above energy policy established by the IRA and the infrastructure law, that we can build even more on this success. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today to understand how we can find a realistic path forward without sacrificing our energy and national security. And with that, I'm going to turn to Ranking Member, my friend, Senator Barrasso.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Chairman, for your very strong statement on the importance of the hearing today and why we're holding the hearing, because as a nation, I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, we are highly dependent on imports of critical minerals and materials. Many of the countries that supply these resources are adversaries, and they clearly, as you said, don't share our values. A Biden administration official went so far as to call our mineral dependence a clear and present danger, and he met with the members of this committee just last week as we sat around to discuss the concerns that we share. That's one of the few statements from this administration that I agree with, because the projected mineral demand is increasing in an amount that is well known to all of us, and it doesn't seem to be understood by the administration. The world demand for copper is expected to increase by 300% by 2040. The Economist last week had an article about this. And where are you going to go for the copper? This administration has shut down a copper mine in northern Minnesota, so where are they going to go? Well, the Economist pointed out in their article, well, there is this place between the border of Iran and Pakistan that we can go to get the copper when we need the demand is up by 300%. Nickel demand is expected to increase by 1,900%. Graphite demand expected to increase by 2,500%. Lithium demand to increase by 4,200%. Much of this demand has been generated from President Biden's policies, compelling, mandating the use of electric vehicles, solar panels, and wind turbines. The United States depends on imports for the vast majority of the minerals used in these products. China is a top producer of lithium and rare earth elements. Democratic Republic of the Congo is a major producer of cobalt and copper. Indonesia produces nearly half of the world's nickel. These nations don't share our values. China ruthlessly exploits a religious and ethnic minority as a source of forced labor in its mining industry. The Congo has tens of thousands of children mining cobalt. Indonesia is clear-cutting vast areas of its tropical rainforest to access its nickel reserves. No moral or ethical sacrifice, including slavery and child labor, seems to be too great for Joe Biden's so-called green transition. America's dependence on foreign minerals is not only shameful and reckless, it is unnecessary. We have more of the resources that we need right here at home, including copper, including lithium, including nickel, graphite, cobalt. Yet this Biden administration's boneheaded policies make it clearly impossible to access them. Recently, Mr. Chairman, scientists reported that the United States may be home to the largest known lithium deposit in the world. In fact, our nation's lithium reserves are estimated to be more than 3 times larger than China's. Yet China's lithium production is 27 times larger than ours. You can see it on the chart. Look at these comparisons, where we get things from and where they exist. The 2 bar graphs show the lithium production and lithium reserves listed by country. We're number 2 in terms of availability. China is number 2 in terms of production. Even compared to countries with robust environmental standards, we are laggards. Australia has less than half of our reserves, but it produces 88 times more lithium than we do. This is ridiculous and unacceptable. The Biden administration seems gleefully intent on keeping us dependent on foreign minerals. It senselessly revoked leases for projects in Minnesota that would have produced nickel and cobalt for electric vehicle batteries. Carelessly revoked approval of a road in Alaska that was needed to develop copper. Recklessly delayed a land exchange necessary for a copper mine in Arizona. And it foolishly proposed withdrawing 10 million acres for mineral development across 6 states in the West, including Wyoming. If it weren't enough, this administration recently issued recommendations that would make it even harder to mine on federal lands. There is an interagency working group, and it's headed by Mr. Boudreau, and he's one of our witnesses today, and the working group wants to fundamentally change the mining claim system. It wants to add new fees and proposes more authority for the administration to withdraw lands from mineral production. Since many of our nation's mineral resources are on federal lands, the group's recommendations will mean less, not more, mineral production here in the United States and more dependence on our enemies. It's a disgrace. Look, said it before, Biden's agenda is not a transition from fossil fuels to sunshine and wind. It is a transition from American energy to foreign minerals. It is a transition from American strength and independence to American weakness and dependence. We must change this reckless course that we are on. We have abundant minerals and abundant energy resources here at home. We only need an administration with the courage and the common sense to use them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. First of all, I want to thank all three of our witnesses for being with us today. I appreciate the effort you made to be here, and we look forward to hearing from you. We have with us today the Honorable Tommy Boudreau, Deputy Secretary of the Department of Interior and Chair of the Interagency Working Group on Mining Laws, Regulations, and Permitting. We have Dr. Daniel Yergin, Vice President, S&P Global, and we have Mr. Mark Compton, Executive Director, the American Exploration and Mining Association. So now we'll hear the remarks, and we'll start with the Honorable Tommy Boudreau.
Thank you very much, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, members of the committee. Thanks for the opportunity to provide testimony today on the administration's commitment to updating our mining policies and promoting sustainable and responsible domestic production of critical minerals. In addition to serving as the Deputy Secretary of the Interior Department, which oversees hard rock mining on public lands, I'm the co-chair of the Interagency Working Group on Mining Laws, Regulation, and Permitting. In many ways, today's hearing mirrors a conversation that Dr. Yergin and I had in Houston earlier this year at the IHS CIRA conference, which was appropriately titled Big Shovels, Supplying the Minerals for the Energy Future. It's a pleasure to be with you again today, Dr. Yergin. It's also a pleasure to join Mr. Compton from the American Exploration and Mining Association. Leadership from the mining industry is going to be essential to this effort. Earlier this month, the working group released its final report, which includes more than 60 specific recommendations to improve and accelerate the way we site, permit, oversee, and reclaim mines on public lands in the United States. This report is the product of President Biden's direction under Executive Order 14017 regarding securing America's supply chains and the bipartisan infrastructure law. The reasons for the President's and Congress's focus on mining reform are clear. Reliable and responsible sources for critical minerals, including lithium, cobalt, nickel, and graphite, are essential to the clean energy and technology revolutions that are shaping our future for the better. This working group's effort kicked off in May of last year with an unprecedented roundtable at the White House that for the first time brought together communities, including the mining industry, local governments, tribes, labor, federal and state partners, academics, and environmental advocates to have a serious conversation about how to meet our needs for these critical minerals while respecting local communities and keeping our lands and waters clean and safe. After hearing all of these viewpoints and receiving nearly 27,000 written comments from the public, the working group identified key changes that will help mine permitting become more efficient and improve our ability to produce our own domestic resources while better engaging and protecting communities impacted by potential mines, especially tribes and rural communities. The biggest takeaway from the report is that our 150-year-old law, signed into law by President Grant, for accessing minerals on public lands needs to be reformed to meet the urgency and standards of the 21st century. I'm not saying we need to rewrite the American mineral laws every century, but maybe every other century we should take a hard look at whether these laws are providing the tools we need to meet today's national security and economic imperatives for critical minerals. The 1872 mining law clearly does not do that. If we are to seize the opportunities for domestic sourcing of critical minerals, we need to employ the same tools that we have been so successful in standing up thousands of megawatts of renewable energy on public lands and offshore. This includes leasing programs that target resources while reducing conflicts with local communities, wildlife habitat, and essential water resources. Moreover, unlike companies that develop energy minerals like oil, gas, and coal from public lands, companies that mine for hard rock minerals pay no royalties to the American taxpayer. This is one of the reasons we do not have the funding necessary to address the estimated 500,000 abandoned hard rock mine sites that create safety hazards and pollute the land and water throughout the country. Recall the Gold King mine incident that turned the Animas River in Colorado orange in 2015. Moreover, important to addressing the prolonged permitting process in this country is the recognition that there is no way to incentivize companies to use their existing mining claims. It's common for speculators to stake claims and sit on them for decades with no intention of ever producing the minerals. The second biggest takeaway from the report is that the way the government and mining companies engage tribes and communities is often too little and too late. Mining companies may spend years and millions of dollars planning for a mine before the public is given details about the proposal and an opportunity to weigh in. This is a recipe for local opposition, lawsuits, and protracted permitting delays. Despite the need for legislative reform, which we will work with Congress on, we are taking on significant reforms through the Bureau of Land Management as we speak. I look forward to discussing those reforms and answering the committee's questions.
Thank you, Mr. Boudreau. And now we have Dr. Yergin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ranking member, members of the committee, very glad to be here to have a chance to discuss these urgent questions which you've been talking about. There, let me start again. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee, it's an honor to be here to have a chance to talk with you about these urgent questions of minerals which you've been discussing since 2021. As Deputy Secretary Boudreau said, we're moving from that term that headline writers like big oil to big shovels, which means a lot more mining. And I was thinking, since you had your original hearings on minerals, there have been a number of alarming messages from international organizations, from governments, including the U.S. government, about the need and the urgency of minerals. The IMF, for instance, has warned that pursuit of net zero emissions will spur unprecedented demand for some of the most crucial metals, leading to soaring costs and shortages that could derail or delay the energy transition. But how much will be needed? It sometimes seems like an abstract question, but one way to think about it is that the state of California has passed a regulation saying that every new car sold in the state of California after 2035 will have to have 2.5 times more copper than every car that's now sold. Now, the regulations didn't say that, but they said that they're going to be EVs, and EVs use 2.5 times more copper for every single car. You say the same thing with offshore wind and so forth. So at S&P Global, we've tried to examine what are the mineral requirements and have done it in our 2 studies that the chairman referred to, the future of copper, and then on the Inflation Reduction Act and its impact on minerals. We came up with this idea of energy transition demand to differentiate. This is new consumption. Consumption come from EVs, on and offshore wind, solar panels, charging stations, battery storage. And this is different from the traditional demand, which is, for instance, the electric wiring in your houses. So our key findings are what have already been described by both the chairman and the ranking member. We see copper demand, in order to meet the various goals out there, having to double by 2035, and other mineral demands growing by 23 times for the United States. And securing these minerals to meet demand will be challenging for all the reasons: capacity, trade patterns, sourcing requirements, geopolitical tensions, and the long and complicated lead times for permitting and judicial reviews for developing new mines. So this will require an expanded international and domestic supply base, realignment of trading patterns to go forward. Those were our numbers before the IRA. Since the IRA, we went back and looked at the numbers again and said that the demand for the 4 minerals that we're talking about will each increase on top of that big increase by another 12 to 15% to meet the demands that are laid out by the IRA. It's also important to recognize that other countries will be competing for these resources. So at the same time, the EU, Japan, China, and other countries, and so this will further test the ability of the U.S. to get these resources. The chairman talked about the concentration. I think there are 2 important parts of concentration. One is the processing that's already been cited, and the dominance of China in those numbers, 70% for nickel and cobalt, for instance. And then it's production. Think about it this way as a comparison. 3 countries produce 40% of crude oil: the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. 2 countries produce 40% of copper. One of them is Peru, which has had 7 presidents in the last few years, and the other is Chile, which is just in the process of nationalizing its lithium resources, which are considered at this point the largest in the world. And then there's a matter of the obsolescing bargain, which is governments, as prices go up, will renegotiate, drive up prices, and that will inhibit investment. I just want to say something now about permitting. We looked at 127 mines that began production between 2002 and 2023. And it took, based upon that, if you started a new mine today, you wouldn't see production till 2040. In 1956, the U.S. Bureau of Mines, which I believe part of the Department of Interior, said it would take 3 to 4 years to bring a new mine on in the United States. Today, it would take about 5 times as long to do that. So, and we do have significant untapped resources, enough copper to meet 20 years of demand that's untapped at this point. So, so much depends on what happens above ground in terms of permitting, in terms of regulation. So I think it's very clear from everything that's going on that the policy efforts to stoke this energy transition demand for minerals will be very effective, as the research shows. However, as you're doing with this committee, greater attention needs to be paid to securing enough supply to undergird these demand ambitions, both domestically and internationally. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. And now we'll have Mr. Compton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, members of the committee, I want to start by thanking the committee for highlighting mineral security issues, as well as your work to create an environment in which the U.S. mining industry can succeed in safely and responsibly providing the raw materials our nation requires for our national defense, economic well-being, and energy security. Unfortunately, a lack of access to our mineral-rich federal lands and a lengthy, inefficient federal permitting system have resulted in our unsustainable dependence on foreign countries for nearly 50 minerals and has empowered our adversaries to weaponize minerals against us. These supply chain concerns have led to bipartisan acknowledgement of the need for more domestic mineral production. Although we may need to obtain some minerals from our allies, we must responsibly utilize our own resources whenever possible. As Dr. Yergin pointed out, the surging global demand for minerals means other countries will be competing for the same limited supplies, challenging our ability to obtain minerals from abroad. Americans and the environment lose when we offshore our mineral requirements. It makes no sense to create mining jobs elsewhere, import minerals from countries with inferior environmental protection and worker health and safety standards, and to generate the CO2 by shipping minerals from faraway places. Because hard rock mineral deposits are rare geologic phenomena, it's imperative that mineralized lands remain accessible to mineral exploration and development. Mines can only be developed in those few places where economically viable deposits were formed and geologists have discovered them. We can't choose where they're located, and we can't move them. More than half of federal lands are already off limits or severely restricted to mining. Further restricting access to mineral resources threatens our mineral security and chills investment. If we can't invest in mineral exploration, we can't discover that needle in a haystack deposit. According to the National Academy of Sciences, only 1 in 1,000 prospects actually becomes a producing mine. Now, there are complex logistics of mining that cannot be changed. But what can be changed is putting the right policies in place to prevent unneeded bureaucratic hurdles to domestic production. And those policies include providing adequate land access and minimizing permitting obstacles. For the past 18 months, we worked closely and in good faith with the Biden administration's interagency working group on mining regulations, laws, and permitting. We viewed the IWG process and development of its report as an opportunity to identify ways to eliminate some of the current barriers to discovering and developing minerals on public lands. Unfortunately, the recommendations in the IWG report related to the mining law will make exploration and mine development harder because they propose eliminating security of land tenure and burden future mines with a confiscatory royalty. Given the skyrocketing demand for minerals, now is an especially bad time to upend this law and implement such proposals. In a broader context, the IWG report, BLM's proposed conservation rule, along with other administrative actions, will ultimately place more lands off limits to mining and ultimately increase our dependency on China and other countries for minerals. We applaud the important NEPA streamline amendments that were in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, but CEQ's proposed NEPA rules will only lengthen the NEPA process and spawn yet more litigation. The bipartisan interest in further permitting reform, though, is very encouraging, and we look forward to future dialogue in this committee on Chairman Manchin's and Ranking Member Barrasso's permitting bills, and in the Environment and Public Works Committee as well. I'd also like to thank the Chairman and Ranking Member for their leadership in boosting the mining workforce of the future by introducing the Mining Schools Act and this committee's markup of that important legislation last week. So we look forward to working constructively with you to seize upon this generational opportunity to ensure that Made in America includes Mined in America, and sourcing minerals from U.S. mines that use state-of-the-art environmental protection measures, put a premium on worker health and safety, and are committed to the communities in which they operate. I look forward to answering any of your questions.
First of all, let me thank all three of you. I appreciate it very much. We'll start with our questioning now. I just have basically, Dr. Juergen, I respect because you've been all over the world. I run into you from different places too, but basically looking and seeing what the facts are and what we're dealing with. The pressure now with us coming on so strong with the demand for EVs, the way the administration is pushing our electric vehicles out the door quicker and not concurring to the law because they want to get more vehicles on the road, more dependency. How much of a strain is that putting on the world market and basically us being able to meet the demand coming from areas of places? My thing, what I said is that I remember the 1974 oil embargo. I remember waiting in line to get my gas so I could go to work. I remember all that. And I just said, I don't want to be waiting. You were my instructor. Anyway, with that, I just said I don't want to wait in line to my battery, any new battery or something for China. Basically said whether I can drive my vehicle or not. That's all I was concerned about. I think it's a wonderful, EVs are wonderful. People like them. They're great and all that, and you buy what you want. But we're incentivizing people, almost bribing them to buy them, and then putting them in a very perilous situation. Tell me what it's doing to the world market as you see it with the basically changes going on around the world. I've talked to the people in the Congo. They're totally upset, but it's a different controlled environment. Tell me what you're seeing.
Well, what's happening is basically trying to, normally energy transitions take about 100 years, and this is trying to do one in 25 years, and that's never been done before, and it's putting pressure on the system. And that's why one of the things I wanted to emphasize that it's not just demand from the United States, but it's demand from elsewhere in the world that's happening at the same time. So it is going to put enormous pressure on the system, and you just don't see how the mining is going to catch up. The supply is going to catch up, and so that will mean prices going up. It'll mean shortages, and then, as has been pointed out by you and Ranking Member Barroso, there is a real imbalance on particularly the processing of it, and it's unbalanced to do that, and it is quite concerning about just how concentrated at this point the supplies are just from a few countries. So I don't envision a sort of 1973 in the sense of a collusion of countries, but you can imagine very tight markets and shortages and a few countries being in a very tight control of supply.
Yeah. Mr. Boudreau, I know that you've been through different administrations seeing basically the balances that need. And I've had conversations, that I think we're out of balance of what we're producing and what we could produce and what we need. With that, the administration doesn't seem to have the urgency to try to get permits and try to basically make sure that we are able to provide our own resources here with the minerals and deposits we have. What can we do to change that? What do you think really needs to be done for us to make a substantial change in how we extract in America?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chairman Manchin. First of all, share all of the views expressed about the need to accelerate reliable and domestic sourcing of critical minerals. This is the fundamental work of the working group, consistent with the executive order and with the direction from Congress under the bipartisan infrastructure law. The trick is, and the hard work is, how do we actually accomplish that? There are some fundamental principles, even setting apart legislative reform of the 1872 mining law. And that means proactive community engagement in order to do deconfliction. This is why it takes way too long to permit a mine in this country, because of community conflict, because of litigation, because of a history of environmental impacts, including to tribes, that is still very much on people's minds. Second, communities need, as part of that, communities need to see the benefit of mining activity, so that communities don't feel imposed upon, but rather feel invested in these developments. So those are the types of administrative reforms that I'm having conversations with the mining community about, and also conversations within the Bureau of Land Management on how we can implement administratively.
I'm going to ask all three of you just one quick question as I'm wrapping up my time, is that the greatest obstacle you think that we face and the most urgent need that we have, would you say it's permitting, or do you have something else that you think that's basically impeding us from moving forward? Or permitting reform is the most critical thing we're facing? If not, we're not going to be able to meet not only the demands of the market, we're not going to be able to meet the ability for us to even implement any of the laws that we have right now to the fullest. Mr. Bourgeois, would I start with you, how your feelings on that? Is permitting?
I agree. One of the biggest challenges is permitting, allowing for responsible mining to go forward. I think there are many examples where there are responsible mines, including mines that have been permitted in this administration, such as lithium mines in Nevada. And so it can be done. I'm fully confident. The timelines do need to be reduced.
I think that permitting and the judicial review that goes on is absolutely the biggest obstacle. I mean, you realize that sometimes the permitting process will be half of a person's professional career. It can take that long. And also what that does to the ability to have capital available to undertake these projects.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it's hard to disagree that about the importance of
Nothing more important than permitting?
What I would point out is, without access to mineral deposits first, and the security of tenure to be able to know that if you find you discover a deposit, you're going to be able to develop that, then permitting never even comes into play.
Let me just say, for the committee's sake, information, I want to compliment both of our staffs our Republican friends on their staff on this side, Senator Brasso's, and our staff on the Democrat side. They've been working diligently on permitting reform. And hopefully we're hope to bring something to the committee that you all can work on, because most of it's in our jurisdiction. We've been meeting with Senator Carper to a certain extent. He has some in his jurisdiction of EPW. We could surprise the world if we can get something done before the end of the year, and we're going to have some substantial, I think, recommendations, hopefully, towards that period. So we're working diligently on this. We have the same conclusion you all have. Senator Brasso.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate all the cooperation that we've had as we work together on the permitting issues, and the work continues. Mr. Compton, as I mentioned in my opening statement, this interagency working group, they recently released a report that contains 65 recommendations. The recommendations include imposing new royalties and fees on mining, elimination of mining claim system that encourages resource exploration. All of these recommendations, if they adopted all of them, would they, on balance, increase or decrease mineral production on federal lands in America?
Well, thank you for the question, Ranking Member Barrasso. As I said in my opening statement, I think ultimately the IWG report, especially taken in context with other administrative actions, will increase our reliance on China and other countries for our mineral needs. The report really is a mixed bag, I would say, but the mining law recommendations in there This is not the time to completely upend our system. The report even acknowledged in the report that converting to a leasing system would cause significant delays in our clean energy objectives.
So then, Secretary Boudreaux, simple questions are not meant to be trick questions. Please, on balance, is it better to mine cobalt here at home or with child labor in the Congo?
Of course, it's better to have reliable domestic sourcing for critical minerals.
Better to mine lithium here or at home or slave labor in China?
Of course, it's better to have reliable supply chains for all of these critical minerals.
Better to mine nickel here at home or raising the rainforests in Indonesia?
As I've said, and is the purpose of the interagency's work, it is to advance the cause of developing reliable sourcing and supply chains for a host of critical minerals necessary for clean energy and technology development.
So then why is the administration and the Secretary blocking access to minerals and making it more difficult, as we've just heard, to mine them here at home?
So I think as members of this committee know, I'm a serious person on these issues, and having a lot of experience across energy projects as well as mining projects. Fundamentally, we need a system and we need to implement reforms that enable that type of development. The main barrier to unlocking America's resources here is conflict and litigation and uncertainty about the permitting process. We need to take that on. That's what the report is intended to do.
So the administration also has issued mineral withdrawals, 26 mineral withdrawals or proposed mineral withdrawals in just the last 2.5 years since taking office. January, the department withdrew 225,000 acres from a site containing 95% of our nation's nickel reserves, 88% of our nation's cobalt reserves, 34% of our nation's copper reserves. We're talking about withdrawals that the administration has done, and the Secretary sat here and seemingly took great credit for. The Biden White House has said that over-reliance on foreign sources and adversarial nations for critical minerals and materials pose national and economic security threats. Yet your Department of Interior continues to make it harder to develop the resources, and we have them right here at home. So how do these mineral withdrawals that your Secretary came here and talked about, how does that help us reduce our nation's dependency on foreign minerals?
So let's talk about where those withdrawals happen. So as an Alaskan, the right place to mine for some of these materials is not in the richest, most abundant salmon fishery in the entire world. As a supporter of a host of economic activity, the right place to mine for some of these materials is not in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota, which is the biggest economic driver in that part of the state. And so these things do have to be viewed in context. Unfortunately, under the existing laws, the only blunt instrument available to the department, and this is why we need more tools, is something like a mineral withdrawal. We need to be able to have a much finer and targeted approach to the development of critical minerals.
So, Mr. Compton, and then to Dr. Yergin, we're developing only a small fraction of our nation's lithium reserves, especially compared to Australia. Is there any reason that why we should be so far behind a nation with similar environmental and labor standards as we have with Australia?
No, of course, there is absolutely no reason we should be, even if we considered ourselves average in permitting with some of these countries, I don't think it's the United States place to be celebrating being average either. So, yeah, we have a lot of work to do on our permitting to get out ahead.
So, Dr. Yergin, how can we here at home drive up our mineral production to levels closer to Australia, specifically with lithium?
Well, I think if we look at Australia and Canada, they have more efficient permitting processes and they get on with it and see it as important as opposed to, and they're both countries with strong mining traditions, so they don't have the kind of divisions that we do. We do see actually of the 4 minerals that we've talked about, particularly 3 of them, the U.S. has the best prospects. Lithium is our best prospect to become a much bigger producer. we're best positioned in that, we think.
So my
And-
final
and we're
question.
seeing- I'm sorry.
No, no. Well, just, the chairman and I were just talking about the fact, how about the court systems and how it drags on? Because I think Mr. Boudreau, Secretary Boudreau just talked also about the litigation involved in slowing all of this down.
Yeah, well, that's why I said it's not only permitting, but it's the judicial review that goes on and on that is unique to our system that makes it so difficult to do it. And even if you wanted to get going now, it's going to take time to get going. But when you look at 20 years to get a project going, you know, we're talking about 2040, 2043.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm with you. Senator Hickenlooper, up early.
I wouldn't go that far. Let me start with you, Mr. Boudreau. Tommy, if I could be so bold. Interior's work, including the USGS critical mineral list, helps inform a lot of the approach you're taking, that our country's taking to these critical supply chain issues. How does the USGS information help other agencies as they work to try and enhance our mineral processing capabilities, strengthen ties with our foreign allies on securing the materials we need for this clean energy future? And, you know, the bipartisan law included funding to map out our nation's critical resources. How is that work progressing from your point of view, and what benefits is that mapping going to provide?
Thank you, Senator. I think it gets at an important issue that Mr. Compton raised about the locatability of these minerals. And so one way that the Interior Department, the federal government, and the USGS in particular can help is with the development of geologic information that can inform both the permitting process as well as prospecting and provide certainty to the industry about where there are high-value resources and also potentially reduce conflict. And so I view that as incredibly important work, and we are lucky to have the USGS as focused on it as they are, and their work is progressing very well.
Great, thank you. And I'm not going to ask a question on this, but obviously Colorado has the Colorado School of Mines, or a number of great mining schools out west, and the chair and the ranking member have led on the Mining Schools Act. And obviously I think how we get the next generation of engineers and geologists and make sure they're training them, we're recruiting them, training them, and retaining them is important. But I'm going to submit that in writing so I can get a chance to ask Dr. Juergen a question. Hopefully I get to all three of you. Dr. Daniel, if I can be so bold, you are an expert in global oil production, and yet back in those dark days in the 90s, no one really foresaw or was able to predict the amazing innovations that would take place, that would take us from a struggling producer to really the global leader. And I guess my question is what do you see, what things can we be doing to push the innovation in our critical minerals? So whether it's through substitution, through its efficiencies, it's, you know, how do we find some way of achieving some of those? Obviously, you couldn't, no one, or very few people, you probably had some notions, but very few people saw that shale revolution coming. Are there other revolutions coming in terms of copper and say, lithium?
Well, the shale revolution did come as a surprise, and it was transformative. It took us from being the largest importer of oil in the world to the largest producer of oil. It's U.S. LNG, based on shale, is 40% now of Europe's LNG supply, and it's been a very important answer to Mr. Putin. At this point, and I'm not a technologist, but we don't understand, we don't see that there is some incredible breakthrough like the shale revolution that will, you know, really transform the mineral situation. But the two things that can, there's obviously an enormous amount of research going on battery technology, also in terms of making mines more efficient and so forth. And then, you know, we will see as time goes on, recycling will become more important, but you're starting from a very small base in terms of doing that, and just collecting and processing in itself is a major industrial activity.
Yeah. I think when there's other opportunities like distributed energy resources, some of those investments will accelerate faster than people think. But I agree with you. I think that we haven't seen where those innovations are, but they're probably there. And I guess that at some point part of the role of this committee is to figure out how do we incentivize and make sure that we're doing that.
Absolutely. That, you know, the research part of it is so important, and it may well come as a surprise. It's just that there's not anything obvious there, and that the time frame for mining is 2 or 3 times longer even than the time frame for oil and gas.
Right. And Mr. Compton, and I'm going to leave out all the bulk. You obviously understand business risk and what mining companies are facing, and that there's always uncertainty when we're trying to attract investment capital for some of these critical projects. Do you see the role, or do you see a role for the federal government to act as a kind of a market smoother, either through stockpiling certain essential minerals or through commitments to buy and sell if certain conditions are triggered, so that we don't at least have the roller coaster effects that sometimes the markets create?
Thank you, Senator. I think the federal government has the ability to be a market smoother just by reducing the uncertainty over how our mining system operates. Perpetual threats, really, to upend our system when, as Dr. Yergin points out, you're a good 20 years from exploration to being able to get ore out of the ground. If we're going to be able to meet those growing mineral demands, we have to incentivize exploration and production now. And from the investment community standpoint, like when they saw the Interagency Working Group's report come out earlier this month, I know one of our members who's a consultant said he spent 3 days on the phone with his clients talking them down off the ledge. He was able to talk them down, but how many others in the investment community are we not able to get that message to?
I appreciate that, and I've got more questions I'll submit in writing, but I yield back to the chair. Thank you. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you. And I turn to our birthday boy today, Senator Bill Cassidy.
39. Some anniversary of 39. So anyway, Mr. Boudreau, I'm from Louisiana. You know a question I'm going to ask you. How's our 5-year leasing plan coming for oil and gas development in the Gulf of Mexico?
We missed your birthday by 1 day. We'll be publishing the 5-year program tomorrow.
That's fantastic. And my birthday will be no inhibitions and no restrictions by the administration. That'll be the birthday present?
The birthday present to Chairman Manchin is that the program is definitely informed by the IRA and the connection that the IRA makes between offshore oil and gas leasing and renewable energy leasing.
So then, staying on the ocean bed, Dr. Yergin, you mentioned we need kind of this technological breakthrough in order to source these critical minerals. But I'm told the ocean beds are full of it, and that we actually have the technology to mine off the ocean bed. And intuitively to me, if you're just scraping rocks off the bottom, it is not the same as an open pit mine. Are we anywhere close to deploying that technology as a means to address this issue?
I think it's very early days. There are some companies that are working on it and have been pursuing it for a couple of years. A lot of minerals there, but there'll be a lot of controversy as well about scraping the bottom of the ocean, I think.
There would be, but nonetheless, there's controversy about anything, right? Mr. Boudreau, is there any effort by the administration to pursue the mining of minerals off the ocean floor?
So I don't want to open up a whole nother can of worms, which was, a big knockdown, drag out, including during the Obama administration. But one area that would be helpful is law of the sea implementation, which provides a framework for accessing.
And I understand that we're actually losing territory because of our delay in implementation, or at least adoption of the treaty, but that if we adopted it, that could potentially open up the next version of the shale revolution to address our unmet needs.
I think that's one of the reasons to adopt the law of the sea treaty.
Let me ask you, going back to lithium mines, and you say it'll take however long in order to permit. In the county in Arkansas that borders Louisiana, they are now mining lithium from the prehistoric ocean, which is below the Smackover Formation. Now, of course, I'm looking at that saying that that prehistoric ocean extends about 25 miles south into Louisiana. And so I'm interested in exploring that. Intuitively, and by the way, Exxon has just made a big investment there, so this is more than a conversation piece, it's money being staked. Intuitively to me, if you're extracting from deep down and you're processing above, that is going to be less problematic in terms of permitting than if you have an open pit mine. Knowing that I've given you a theoretical, but does that intuition sound good to you? And is there anything USGS could do to see if those subterranean resources are viable?
Yeah, and I think this goes to an earlier question of Dr. Yergin. There is massive opportunity for technological development, especially with respect to lithium. And so one of the efforts from so mining, sourcing, all important, but one of the main and most promising lines of effort is technological development, both brining, and there's a project we're working on in Southern California focused on deriving lithium from other activities. And I think the type of opportunities you're describing, while they require further technological development, are activities that should be supported.
But it seems as if this is already taking place. Again, they've been processing lithium out of this Smackover Formation in Arkansas for some time now. I think they may also be getting cobalt, but I'm a little bit kind of having to think about that twice. So I just encourage that because I think in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, we actually had dollars for USGS to go out and find more resources. And of course, I'd like them to find them in my state for all the reasons, not least of which it would supply the rest of the United States with the needed resource.
Yeah, I understand and agree.
Lastly, in your analysis, in your life cycle analysis of greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera, associated with new developments in the United States, do you take into account the life cycle greenhouse gas emission profile of a project overseas? So, for example, if we're trying to supplant cobalt coming from the Congo that is used with child labor and goes to China where they use coal as primary feedstock for energy, yes, we may have a little bit of a footprint here, but it's substantially less than the life cycle of the other. Is that taken into consideration? Because sometimes it seems like we make the perfect the enemy of the good.
Yeah, so agree completely that when you're looking at any particular project, viewing it within a global context is important. I think one of the opportunities and benefits for more reliable permitting of critical minerals in the United States is exactly what you described as reduced carbon footprint.
Yeah, but again, are we comparing ourselves to that which we would be competing against, or are we comparing ourselves to some pure standard? Because it seems oftentimes that we're comparing ourselves to a pure standard, not recognizing that we, as somebody mentioned earlier, are actually doing it with the lowest carbon footprint in the world oftentimes.
Yeah, so in the realm of permitting critical minerals, while relevant, carbon emissions are often the less significant impacts compared to, in particular, impacts on water resources.
Thank you. I yield. Thank you.
Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the ranking member for this important hearing. I thank you to all the panelists. I appreciate all of your comments. I say this time and again, Nevada, my home state, has 85% of federal public land and has the largest mining program on public land in the country. It supports nearly 33,000 jobs in the state. It's a key contributor to our economy. It's a social safety net for many rural and remote communities in my state. So as we are having this conversation, we take the necessary steps to address climate change. I agree. We have to do so in a fashion that makes America more productive, secure, and self-reliant. At a very basic level, this means we have to produce minerals in the United States and not solely rely on foreign sources. And I think we've all been talking about that. Here's my conundrum, and I'm hopeful I'm going to ask the Deputy Secretary this first question. I understand the administration has this all-government approach to addressing our future security needs when it comes to our clean energy, including as it pertains to mining. But here's my struggle. Just last week, the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Committee imposed new limits, or actually proposed imposing new limits on eligible entities to be considered for the FAST 41 expedited permitting process. The Council's proposed limits would remove mining as a covered sector and limiting eligibility to just critical mineral projects. What does that mean? That means that copper mines would be ineligible despite a critical material, being a critical material according to the Secretary of Energy. So how can this happen just after the report that was put out that said mining is critical to our future and our needs? Can you address what is happening? It seems like the administration, even though they have this all-government approach, many pillars of it are not talking to one another. And I don't know if you have a response, Mr. Boudreau, but I would sure love to hear one.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. I do have a response. I actually participated in a FIPSI meeting yesterday where talked about specifically this issue. And so on the one hand, the proposal to include mining as a covered activity under FAST 41, I think, is very positive. And that's what it is. It's a proposal to do that. It is a draft, and we are having exactly that conversation about whether these sort of parameters around qualification are the appropriate ones. And so we do hear you on that, and it's an active conversation and one that I will carry forward into the steering council.
Thank you. And let me put one other thing out there, because I know the new proposal specifically identifies USGS critical mineral list for utilization. But unless I'm wrong, Department of Energy and the Department of Defense have their own lists of strategic and critical materials that are central to our energy and national security that include more minerals that are on that USGS critical mineral list. So how is that? Hopefully there's a coordination around these so that all of the agencies are working together as well and not limiting access to these essential minerals that we need.
Yeah. So I think part of the complexity there is distinctions between, energy-related minerals and other types of minerals. So, for example, on the USGS list, they don't include, uranium, plutonium, et cetera. I agree with you that having a multitude of lists about what's critical and applying, that adjective creates a lot of confusion. And so I do think, bringing perspective into sourcing as opposed to whether you're on the list or off the list makes sense.
Thank you. Excuse me. And so, Mr. Compton, I only have a few seconds left, but I have a couple of questions with respect to the Interagency Working Group Mining Reform Report. You touched on one, the distinction between the claim location system and the leasing system. Can you talk about also the 7 cents per ton tax on moving unprocessed ore? Because it may sound good, but what does it actually mean in practical implementation?
Thank you for the question. In all due respect, I'm not sure that it even sounds good. We affectionately, or maybe not so affectionately, refer to that as a dirt tax. There really is no explanation for why there would be a tax just for moving dirt, or how many times that dirt movement is taxed. I mean, because you move overburden several times throughout a mining process. So 7 cents per ton may sound like a minuscule amount, but when you consider the massive amounts of earth that is needed to move to uncover some of these deposits, we have estimated that it would cost several $100 million per year to the mining industry, much of which obviously would be in Nevada.
And moving dirt is not unique, is part of the hard rock mining process, isn't that correct?
You cannot unearth these deposits without it. Yeah.
Thank you. My time is up. Thank you.
Thank you, and I agree wholeheartedly with you, Senator. I can't believe I'm saying this because it's Senator Hovind's turn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
It's early.
I came early because it was Cassidy's birthday.
I'm sure he's pleased he stayed and listened to you.
You're on a roll today. Isn't he, Governor? So, Secretary Boudreau, Thanks for being here. We appreciate your willingness to come out to North Dakota as you have, and look forward to having you out there again. I think it's very important for you to get out in the ground, so appreciate you doing that. In the Fiscal Responsibility Act, we set timelines on EAs and EISs, 1 year on an EA, 2 year on an EIS. How are you coming with getting that implemented?
Yeah, thanks. And I do look forward to next time I get to visit North Dakota. We've established, and in fact, components of this brought forward from the previous administration, a review process by which, at my level in the department, we track NEPA documents, both for content and quality, but also timing. And it is through that process that we're implementing the timing requirements under this year's legislation.
Yeah, that's going to be really important. I mean, we've got to bring certainty, just listening to all three, we've got to bring certainty to this process, and that's an effort to do it. And I believe simplicity is really important. When we talk about permitting reform, pretty soon it gets so confusing, and then everybody has their own interpretations. And that's why we push for that kind of simple regulatory requirement, the 1 year and the 2 year time frame. So I think that's really important if we're going to get after these critical minerals like I think we all want to. Would you agree with that?
I agree. The only addition I would make to it is, at the end of the day, these are the documents we get sued on. And so I am very focused always on quality. And so schedule, certainty on timeline is essential, but nothing throws a project off like protracted litigation. And so the quality has to be there as well.
Right, precisely where I'm going. I think it was you, Dr. Yergin, that mentioned judicial review and how that is slowing us down. This goes to what Mr. Compton was talking about, where in Australia or Canada it's taking, 2 or 3 years to get these things permitted, and here it's 7 to 10. In our state, and somebody else mentioned the plays like the shale plays, and in the Bakken, we went from less than 100,000 barrel a day of oil production to 1.5 million a day at peak, but we put the right legal, tax, and regulatory framework in place to do it. And so we've got to do that for critical minerals. So to you, Dr. Yergin, and then you, Mr. Compton, how do we get, including judicial review, how do we get that legal, tax, regulatory structure in place? What's it going to take? Or we're not going to get after these critical minerals, and we're going to be dependent on places like China, right? I mean, isn't that really what it comes down to?
I think that's right. And I mean, at the end of the day, nothing happens if you don't have capital that's invested. And people are not going to invest capital if there's that high degree of uncertainty. I mean,
So even if Secretary Boudreau gets those things implemented, and we knock that down to, say, a 2 year or 3 year time frame like Canada, Australia, if you get tied up in court for the next 7, it's still 10 years, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, yeah, so I don't know what you do about the judicial review side of it, but it isn't just the permitting, it's what goes on after that, and stage after stage after stage, and some of you know very well how some of these projects just go on as judicial review.
Point is, we have to do both if we're going to get this done.
Yes.
Mr. Compton.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. If I could jump in on that too. You're absolutely right. Litigation reform, I think, needs to be a central component of further permitting talks, and I'm confident that is going to be part of further meaningful permitting reform. But I can give you several ideas to include in that as well. The 2020 NEPA regulations put in place by the prior administration actually contained some very helpful litigation reforms. Those have been rolled back. But some things that could be done legislatively, lowering the statute of limitations.
Well, isn't that it? We almost have to do it legislatively because otherwise new regulations get put in place that defeat the whole effort.
Yes, it certainly needs to be in statute. Limiting the agency's time to act on remand would be helpful.
So it's instructive if we actually want to develop the mining here in this country, we better get after it statutorily or we're going to be subject to more regulatory burden that's going to stop it in its tracks.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just put this hearing in a little bit of perspective. We're not talking about rolling back mining regulations or shortening statute of limitations in order to have somebody make more money. We're trying to beat climate change. And we're in a race, and it's a race in a matter of months and years. I just heard on the radio this morning that glaciers in Switzerland have declined 10% in the last 2 years. That's astounding if you think about that. These are glaciers that have been there for thousands of years. So we have to, this is an urgent environmental priority. And it strikes me that one of the problems is that we're treating this as sort of environmental growth or environmental protection. Green energy is over here and permitting reform is over here, and they're not related. They're intimately related. For example, one of the things we haven't talked about today is grid access. We have environmental projects, wind and solar projects that can't get on the grid because of the inadequacy of the grid. Well, that means there's going to have to be transmission. I was at a meeting last week on transmission. There are 3 major transmission projects in the West, the shortest of which has been at 21 years. From the time of the inception of the project to the time it's going to go online, the longer, I think, is about 25 years. That's another example of exactly what we're talking about. So I guess what I would like, and perhaps we could take this for the record, is some specificity about what makes it take 14 years to do a mine. In other words, how much is NEPA, how much is local permitting, how much is state, how much is litigation? Do you see what I'm asking, Mr. Compton? It would help us, I think, if we knew exactly where the bottlenecks were, and then we can move to try to address them. By the way, the comment about litigation reminded me of Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, Dickens' famous case in Bleak House, where the lawyers passed the litigation on from generation to generation. You said half of a person's life could be spent permitting one project. How about the role of state and local permitting? Because we're all talking about federal permitting and NEPA, but aren't state and local permitting issues also at stake here, Mr. Compton?
They absolutely are, and we need better coordination between federal and state and local permitting, and being able to, when one or the other has completed analysis, for the others to be able to use that analysis. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if we are truly going to tackle climate change, we have to get serious about this now. And to your point about the various phases of mining and in the mining life cycle, every bit of those phases need to be constricted. You know, exploration can take up to 10 years or more before we even get to the start of permitting. Having the USGS doing additional research and mapping and sharing that information with mining companies can help shorten that period of time.
That's a good example. I mean, I think what we need is a little bit of urgency on this issue, because we are in a race with the warming climate and the effects, the catastrophic effects that's going to have on us. And it just can't be the sort of plodding, oh, it takes a long time to do a transmission project. Let me change the subject a bit from mining. What about processing? There's a major production of lithium in Australia, which is a pretty friendly country, but 85% of the processing is in China. Do the permitting delays we're talking about here also apply to processing? Because that's where it seems to me we need to be discussing that as well as getting the material out of the ground. Processing it's no good unless it's processed. Mr. Yergin, talk to me about processing.
Yeah, I mean, processing is often is a very intense and in China, pretty environmentally heavy activity to do that. And so, we used to have, I think, 12 copper smelters in the United States. I think we're down to 2 now. I think it would be pretty hard to actually build a new copper smelter and also go through the permitting of that. So it's not just the mining that we need to think about, but the real choke point on the minerals beyond mining is where the processing is. And that's, it doesn't get as much attention, but it also needs to be looked at really carefully. Just physically, what's involved in building this, and are people willing to commit the capital to do it?
I do think that's an important subject that we should be talking about, Mr. Chairman, is processing as well as extraction. Finally, I want to submit for the record an article by Bill McKibben in Mother Jones, where the title of the article says a lot about what the article says. It's called Yes in My Backyard. And it's Bill McKibben's account of his journey from a strong environmental activist whose primary job was to stop things to the realization that in order to achieve a green energy future, we need to build things. And that you can't, this is me, not Bill McKibben, you can't love EVs and hate lithium. And you can't love solar and wind projects and hate transmission. This is absolutely a part of it. And what bothers me sometimes is that you'll have 100 units of environmental benefit from a project and 8 units of environmental detriment, and it doesn't get built. And we're missing a major environmental benefit. So thank you all for your testimony today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great hearing, great panel. Thank you for this. You know, we've all recognized that when it comes to minerals, we can't define or pick where the location is. The location is where they are. And so often, part of the challenge as we're trying to access minerals is how do we access them? How do we get them to the processing facilities? And in Alaska, of course, we're particularly challenged because of our vast distances. We've got a community in the interior of Alaska, Fairbanks. You're probably not going to find a more pro-mining community, but that community is divided right down the middle right now because there is a very significant mining prospect about 250 miles from Fairbanks, and they're moving forward. There will be great benefits to the native village that is situated nearby, but they're going to be trucking that rock 240 miles to another mine site for the processing. And it's the access that has really confounded folks. And as I've shared with some in the administration, I read articles where here in the Biden administration, we are proposing to send $150 million working with an Australian mining company for a mine in Africa, and to help advance that mine, we're putting forward $250 million to help advance a rail line to Tidewater to help facilitate that. I can tell you the people of Interior would certainly appreciate some assistance from our own government with how we might be able to do a rail extension to get those resources more safely out. We have other mining projects, and the Deputy Secretary and I have had multiple conversations about Ambler. Again, a very lucrative and prospective mineral deposit in the interior of the state, but in order to access it, it will require a mine of several hundred miles, and that has faced its own challenges. So, Deputy Secretary, I'd like to ask you for the record, just for a confirmation here on the Ambler project. When we had Secretary Haaland before this committee, May 16th of 2023, and I asked her when we should expect to see the record of decision finalized, she indicated, she said, yes, the ROD by 2023, that continues to be the plan. Then a few days later, on May 19th, we have a DOJ attorney submit to the U.S. District Court a court-ordered update, now claims that a final SEIS is not anticipated until 2024, not expected to be signed until the second quarter of 2024. So again, Alaskans want to know, you're talking about how we're going to do a better job of expedited permitting. That's what this working group was kind of designed to do, and yet in a matter of 4 days, we see a 6-month slippage. So for the record, if you can just share where we are with the record of decision on Ambler.
Thanks very much. We'll be publishing the draft supplemental EIS for the Ambler Road in the coming weeks. We're still on that timeline to complete the analysis and issue a record of decision. issue a recorded decision in the second quarter of next year.
The second quarter of '24. So what the Secretary stated before the committee, that it would be the end of '23, is not accurate. It is now second quarter '24.
The schedule that the updated schedule we submitted in the litigation, which is why we have to do the supplemental analysis, is still the schedule that we're on.
Let me ask about the department's interagency working group. The chairman has raised that, and apparently there was a little bit of back and forth in terms of what has been produced by this report. The report acknowledges its requirements under the infrastructure bill, but when you parse through the pages of it, 169 pages, it's tough to find where the report actually addresses many of the issues that are required by the law. Whether it's the period of time that is typically required to complete each step, the processing of applications, operating plans, leases, license, permits. And so I think we were pretty clear in the infrastructure bill that this is what we expected. We didn't just expect a report saying this is in response to your query, but we actually asked for some timeframes for these activities. So can you give me some more clarity on the timeframes and kind of what the department is doing to address some of these data gaps?
Yeah, and happy to have follow-up conversation on all of that, those questions. Fundamentally, one of the challenges we have, which is the reason why one of the core recommendations is a leasing program, understanding that a lot would have to be thought through for a program like that, is we don't have a lot of control over the process. We don't have control over when we can expect to receive a mine plan of operations. We don't have control over diligence requirements, et cetera, that we do have in other contexts, including oil and gas, including renewable energy. And so part of what I would like to see is a permitting structure that can hold us accountable, but also hold operators accountable for responsible development. And I'll just note that anyone who thinks Canada is the perfect model for this activity should talk to Senator Murkowski.
Yeah, thank you for that. We do have a couple little issues there. Mr. Chairman.
Acting.
Okay, Mr. Acting Chairman, I'll direct to you. I would like to do some follow-on with regards to the working group, but I was going to ask Dr. Yergin, my time has expired, but the big question here is how we move the needle now. We're all talking about the urgency. We can talk about it's going to be 35% more, it's 2 times more, it's 17 times more. The urgency is clearly there. We recognize that, and yet we're not moving the needle like we need to. And we can say we've got to legislate on the permitting side, and we have to do that, but we have to recognize that we've got litigation that we have to deal with. But we also have this issue of social license to operate, and that kind of drives the litigation piece of it. And in fairness, it influences the politics on the permitting side and all that goes on there. And so I don't want it
Senator,
question for the record, but
can you defer the answer until we let our two remaining
No,
senators?
no. I'm not going to ask the question. I'm just going to put it out there because I would like somebody else to answer that or to ask that, because I'm going to be waiting around because the conversation is just too good.
Thank you. Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Yergin, so we have a few companies in Arizona. One in particular is a business called Urbix that does processing of graphite. And I'm concerned that some of the joint ventures that are currently being formed in some of these free trade jurisdictions with Chinese partners are skirting the intent of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's potentially subsidizing our competitors instead of helping businesses like the one I mentioned. Urbix, who is in Maricopa County, who processes graphite. So Dr. Jurgen, have you seen these joint ventures? Like, what do you know about them, and what impact do you expect that they have on U.S. domestic jobs and U.S. production?
Well, I haven't, studied them in detail, but the fact is that, the reality was that until about 2019, 2020, people just were not paying attention much to this issue at all. And the way that the industry developed is globally is with China being a very important, a predominant player. And so I think the reality is that those entities exist. I don't know whether the specific ones are competing with the companies that you're talking about, but this issue of critical minerals is so entangled with our changing relationships with China, and they're not what they were 4 or 5 years ago, and it's not going to get easily untangled at this point. But you can try and continue to shift the balance, which is what the recent legislation is aiming to do.
Yeah, we've heard that, as Urbix and companies like them try to sign contracts, it's often challenging because of, the joint ventures that exist in these free trade jurisdictions. Right. So it does need to be addressed, and we've got to get this back on track. Mr. Compton, so Arizona's leading the way in resource development that's going to help power this clean energy economy for decades. And the first and only mine in the FAST-41 process is a mine called South 32 Hermosa project. It's in Santa Cruz County. And this is the only domestic advanced mine development project that can produce 2 critical minerals, zinc and manganese. So, Mr. Compton, I'm sure many of your members are watching this FAST-41 process closely. And what outcomes do you feel will make the process more appealing to your members?
Well, thank you for that question, Senator. Yes, actually South 32 and their Hermosa project is a member of ours as well. And so we've been watching that very closely, and as I'm sure many of our members are. We were very pleased to have mining added as a covered sector a couple of years ago. As you note, the Hermosa project is the first one to be on the permitting dashboard. Ultimately, the whole FAST-41 process was implemented to permit large infrastructure projects in a more timely manner. And so that's what we need to see out of this process is expedited permitting, and doing so, by the way, in a way that does not take short shrift to our environmental regulations. And so one of the things for me is if we can do it for these large infrastructure projects without shortchanging our environmental laws and regulations, why can't we do that for all projects? Mm-hmm. So that's why the process with FAST-41, with more transparency, better agency coordination, it's all things that we need in permitting for all projects. That's why it was frustrating, this came up a little earlier in the hearing, that FIPSI last week proposed to now limit the mining projects that would be available under FAST-41 to only those designated as critical mineral projects. I understand the Hermosa project is, and that's great, but we've got an awful lot of projects out there that may not be necessarily deemed critical according to the USGS, but I would submit that the entire periodic table is critical.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now we have Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Boudreau, let me start with you. Are you aware that there is currently a strike going on nationwide by auto workers in this country?
I'm aware of the auto workers strike. Yeah.
So I just returned from my home state of Missouri. We're in Wentzville, Missouri. That's right outside St. Louis. About 4,000 workers are striking. I was on the picket line with them on Monday, talking to them about their concerns, what it is they hope for their future. I talked to folks who were as young as 20 and had been there for a couple of months, and folks who had been there for 40 years and were nearing retirement. And one thing I heard consistently is they're worried about the future of their jobs. You know, the younger workers, is there going to be auto working jobs in this country after this administration finishes forcing the auto industry into an electric vehicle production that is made predominantly overseas? I'm sure you know where most electric vehicles are made in the world.
It is an enormous priority for the administration, part of the reason why the president himself joined auto workers in the strike to
Where are 54% of electric vehicles made globally?
the entire point of
Where are 54% of electric vehicles made globally?
the whole point is
No, I'm asking you a question. Where are 54% of electric vehicles made globally?
I don't
You don't know?
I don't know about that number. I know that
The answer is
point-
the answer is China. Where is
And the
the
point
critical? Wait, hold on a
we're
minute.
here.
Hold on a minute. Where is 73% of cobalt refining? Where does it take place globally?
overseas,
Where specifically?
probably China.
Yeah, China. Where is most cobalt mining performed? Who owns most of the cobalt mines in the world?
Probably most of that sourcing is in Africa.
China has the majority. 77% of electric vehicle cathodes are made in China. 92% of anodes are made in China. 66% of battery cells are assembled in China. The New York Times recently did a report on this. The New York Times, not a notably right-wing publication, that said, can the world make an electric car battery without China? Their conclusion, the only winner so far is China. My question is, why would we want to make our auto industry dependent on supply chains in China? Why is that a good idea?
We don't.
Then why are you doing it?
The entire point of this conversation, the entire point of this hearing is to domesticate and make more reliable the sourcing of the materials to support.
Then why are you shutting down critical mining in the United States?
We're not.
You are. Why did you close the Twin Metals mine in this country earlier this year? 225,000 acres in Minnesota, which mines critical minerals like copper, nickel, cobalt.
Again, the entire point of this conversation is to do mining in a responsible way that also reconciles with
In a
other
responsible way. First of all, answer my question. Why did you close the Twin Metals mine?
because of the threat to the boundary waters, which is one of the largest economic drivers in Minnesota.
So you think that we shouldn't have critical supply chains in the United States, jobs, good-paying jobs with labor protections in the United States?
Not at the expense of one of the richest fisheries in the United States and the world, such as in Alaska and the Pebble Mine, not at the...
The Twin Metals mine isn't in Alaska. It's in Minnesota. It's 225,000 acres in Minnesota.
Correct. And my point is, as we look to accelerate the development of domestic critical mineral mining, we have to do it in a way that does not conflict with and deplete other important aspects of the economy. In northern Minnesota, that includes the recreation economy and the boundary waters, which is one of the main drivers of tourism.
So you're going to prioritize recreation over good-paying jobs here in this country for mining? You're going to withdraw this mine that has been online and now shutter it?
The number of jobs generated by the boundary waters and tourism dramatically outpaces the potential of that mine.
I thought it was critical that we had supply chains in this country, and yet you're shutting down critical mineral production in this country. Do you know instead what that's making us reliant on? Do you know what China's labor practices are? For instance, at their cobalt mine in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Have you seen the reporting on this?
You'll get no argument for me that domestic sourcing...
They use child labor is the answer to my question. Child labor. In harrowing
labor
conditions.
and also religious
China
minorities.
uses Uyghur labor,
Yeah.
slave
Yes, they
labor.
do. Yes, they do.
And yet, you are making us dependent on imports from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, controlled by China, from Chinese-controlled and owned mines all across the world. You're shutting down our mines here in the United States.
Well, we disagree about all of that.
Would you support, well, facts are facts, and sometimes they're tough. But what's going to be really tough is when we don't have any auto jobs left in this country because you ship them all overseas, when we can't mine anything in this country because you're shutting it all down. And we all know why. It's in pursuit of your radical environmentalist agenda. That's the real answer
Senator,
here.
your time is up. Let me just say this, Senator, that first of all, the Twin Metals project has never operated. It's never been operational.
You know, Senator, with due respect, I've sat here and listened to my colleagues who went 2 and 3 minutes over. So I've been very patient. I think I'm the last person to question. Maybe it's Senator Lee.
Senator Lee's waiting for you.
Okay. Well,
You
I'd be
come back, you
happy
want
to.
second round?
That'd be
Second
fine.
round?
I'll sit here. I'm happy to do it. I'm
We're
sure
not
you'll
here-
give me some time.
We're not here to berate. We're basically here to try to get information how to do it. We've passed legislation, which I don't think you voted for, that give us more dependency as far as.
Senator, I'm here to ask questions and to get answers.
Well, you're here to, it's demagoguery. I mean, you're basically attacking every witness we have. You always have. I'm sorry, we just disagree, okay? I'll come back to you. Senator Lee.
Mr. Boudreau, thank you for being here today. I want to get to some issues about mining here in just a moment, but before I do that, I need to ask you very quickly about a couple of things. First, about Interior's contingency plan for the potential government shutdown this weekend. I'm frustrated, surprised, upset, angry that Interior still hasn't published its plan for the national parks. You know, communities rely on that plan for what will potentially happen here in just a few days if the government shuts down. Communities surrounding our national parks, units, and that's important. So you must understand the huge economic impact that shutting down national parks would have on individuals and communities across the country, but especially in Utah, where we have a lot of national park units. So just yes or no, because I don't have a whole lot of time here. Does the Interior Department plan to keep national park units open in the event of a shutdown?
So to answer the question, I spoke with Governor Cox this morning. I spoke with Governor Gordon last night from Wyoming. We are aware of the potential for a shutdown. Obviously, the best thing that could happen is not to shut down the government, not to shut down our parks. But we will work with the state of Utah, as we always have, to ensure that we minimize that type of economic disruption.
Okay,
and there
I
are
appreciate
mechanisms to do that.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate you reaching out to Governor Cox around that. We do have plenty of ways to do this. As I pointed out to a letter that I sent to Secretary Haaland just a few days ago, you should be designating as essential as many park and land management employees as possible and using FLREA fee revenues to fund essential operations. Unfortunately, it sounds like some states, including Utah, may be forced yet again to use state funds to keep our national parks open. We're grateful to have lots of national parks in Utah. It's one of the things that goes along with that. I introduced legislation this week to make sure that these states that utilize state resources to keep those open in the event of a shutdown and in the event that you decide to shut down the park units, to make sure that those states are repaid by the federal government in a timely manner, just as we repay in a timely manner federal workers furloughed during a shutdown. Yes or no, will Interior support that effort on that bill?
Again, the best thing that could possibly happen is that we avoid this by avoiding a shutdown. And I know folks in the Senate are working very hard in that way. I don't have any pending legislation in front of me on that. I think there is a history of that type of legislation, however.
Okay, I'd ask you to take a look at that. My hope and my request is that you not oppose it. Now, let's talk about the recent decision by Interior to lock up 960,000 acres in northern Arizona, a shameless abuse of the Antiquities Act. This land contains the purest uranium deposits in North America, a critical fuel for nuclear power, which in turn is going to be vital for the objective of achieving a so-called carbon-free future. Instead of accessing our pure reserves here at home, the Biden administration would rather apparently have us be completely dependent on Russia, which supplies almost half of our enriched uranium supply today. Mr. Boudreau, do you realize, do you really believe that restricting and blocking up access to highly mineralized federal lands in the U.S. will help counter Russian and Chinese control of mineral supply chains?
So the example you're pointing to, I think, really highlights the challenge we have in this space. So the example you're pointing to is the recent national monument designated by President Biden to protect the watershed around the Grand Canyon, one of the most iconic places in the world, one of the most important national parks outside of Utah. And it was a monument proposal sponsored by a coalition of tribes, which have borne the brunt of uranium development and other types of mineral development. And so those are exactly the types of issues that, in order to, consistent with what Senator Hawley is advocating for, centralize and make more sound supply chains in the United States, we have to deal with.
We do have to deal with it, but you have a whole lot more to deal with now that you've abused the Antiquities Act yet again in this manner. It baffles me, absolutely baffles me, that the Biden administration, on one hand, thinks it can magically change the weather by pushing for a rapid energy transition, where the United States becomes a green wonderland full of solar panels and big batteries, and everyone drives around in a $60,000 SUV. But then, on the other hand, at the very same time, you're doing everything you can to lock up uranium in Arizona, nickel in Minnesota, copper in Alaska, thinking that if you stop mining from happening here in the U.S. and leave it to the child laborers in Congo, you'll have magically saved the climate and the planet. This madness needs to stop.
Thank you, Senator. And we're going to go with our second round. Let me just say this to Senator Hawley. I'm sorry if you believe I've been differential. But on that, I know our busy schedules you have and other different committees, everything that you are saying, we feel the same. And it's been bipartisan on both sides. I'm going to go to Senator Murkowski first for her second round, then come right back to you.
That's fine, Mr. Chairman. I just say this, though. Don't characterize my questions as demagoguery when I'm trying to get answers.
Sir,
we've had people in front of here up at this committee.
We've been through this because everybody basically has asked the same questions you were on that.
Senator, you don't get to control what questions I ask or don't ask.
No,
and
no,
quite
no, I'm
frankly,
just
I
saying
think
the
what
way
you're
we
doing
ask
is
it.
abusive.
We've been
and I'm going to
talking.
call you out on it. Okay?
Oh, I'm going to call you out many times too.
Well, that's fine.
That's not a problem, but I'm in chairman right now and you're out of order. Senator Murkowski.
Mr. Chairman, this is a committee that historically, I've been on this committee now for 20 years, maybe 21, I don't know. But we are a committee that I think has been viewed both internally here in the Senate and externally as a committee that really likes to focus on policy. We really like to focus on the hard things because there are hard things when it comes to how we power, how we move our country, how we can be competitive. And so I think the good debate, the hard questions are good, are fair, and I would just encourage all of us that how we approach our questions, there's a level of respect that comes with all of it. If we were really trying to get answers to the hard questions, it's how we treat one another, how we treat our witnesses with respect, and how we really try to get good value from this. I want to go back to the question that I asked, and I do apologize, Senator Hawley, because I had gone over my time. And I think we kind of took advantage of the fact that the chairman was not in his chair at that time. That's my bad. But I really do want to know the answer, and it may not be answerable. But Dr. Yergin, you have more expertise in these areas than anybody I know. You have seen us move from a country of vulnerability, great vulnerability, and exposure when it came to our oil resources, to figuring out how we then become that lead country, exercising that extraordinarily global position where we can influence what goes on with the markets. We have a role that we should be proud of in this country, and we should all, Republicans and Democrats, I don't care what administration you're part of, should want to try to encourage and continue. And unfortunately, with critical minerals, it's a little bit of deja vu all over again. We can see ourselves getting trapped in that same place where we have the resource here, but for a multitude of different reasons, far too often, it just comes down to the politics of it. We lock it off from ourselves. We make ourselves vulnerable on others, and that's a dangerous place to be, particularly at a time when we see China eating our lunch in many of these areas when it comes to the ability to process, really when it comes to mining in places where, and I agree with you, Deputy Secretary, there are places that we should not be mining. I think we know that, but we also know that we do it better, safer, cleaner here in this country. So let's figure out how we make it happen, as we did with oil, the success that fracking brought. So I raised the question, you've heard it already. We stall ourselves out by permitting issues that we haven't been able to get on top of, and despite what we did in the last measure where we said, okay, we're going to put some timelines here on EAs, that's not enough. It's not enough. And if we think that that's good enough, we're fooling ourselves. The litigation piece of it is you talk to anybody that's trying to develop oil, gas, minerals, they are baking litigation time into their project planning, into their base budget. It is a reality that is just awful. But so much of that then comes from, you got to get the social license to operate. So we're talking about it all the time. Are we just talking to ourselves? Why can't we get people in this country, young people particularly, to get what Senator King was pointing to, was that the environmental considerations here are equally important. What do we have to do? I guess I'm asking you to be the marketing man here.
I think that's a pretty big question. I think it's a question. I was thinking as you're pointing this out, it's late to the party. I mean, until a few years ago, mining was something that did not attract capital, was not very interesting in the United States. It's really changed because of the discussion about energy transition and EVs, but also because of the geopolitics. So it's really an effort of catching up, and I think it is a communications thing to understand that, as the IMF, as I quoted at the beginning, says, you're not going to have the energy transition if you don't have the minerals. And that's just a fundamental factor. And I think,
but we have the minerals.
Yeah.
We just need to access them.
Yeah. And I think it was interesting that I think Senator Hoeven mentioned the 7 to 10, that delays. That actually comes from a study that one of our predecessor companies did in 2015. I think it's really time that we've got to really look at that again, because I suspect that it's actually a longer time frame now. But I think this committee and what you're doing is reversing it, but it's just something that's not going to happen overnight, and mining is a long time horizon industry.
Thank you, sir. Senator Hawley.
Mr. Boudreaux, let's come back to the question of the Congo that we were talking about. So if you are opposed to the child labor practices of China in the Congo, will you support the legislation introduced by some of our colleagues in the House that would prohibit all imports of cobalt mined using child or forced labor?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that legislation.
Senator Boudreaux, if you could put your microphone so we could just put it over towards you, because I think, there you go, like that. Okay.
I'm not familiar with that legislation. I do agree with you that those types of practices are practices that we need to eliminate from our sourcing of critical minerals.
So you would support a prohibition, you would support a ban on imports in principle of any of these critical minerals that have been mined using child labor?
No, I support working hard to transition away from sources that use those types of practices.
Well, why not ban it? Why not say if it's got child labor in the supply chain, we're not going to import it in this country. We're not going to prop up child. Wait, I'm not done yet. We're not going to prop up child labor in this country or fund it.
I think an abrupt ban would, again, I haven't studied this issue. One of the questions I would ask in connection with a ban like that would be what the impacts, including economic disruption, of such a ban would be.
Well, the impact would make slave labor and child labor extremely expensive. It would make American labor a lot more attractive. That's what it would do. It would incentivize jobs with labor protections in this country. Shouldn't we want that?
Again, I haven't reviewed that legislation. I don't know what the impacts of it would be. I agree with you that getting reliable sourcing that does not associate with those types of practices should be the goal of the United States.
But you can't agree that we should ban it.
Again, I haven't studied the legislation. It's hard for me.
Well,
to
then
answer
what,
that
I guess,
question.
let me just ask you a broader question. What steps are you taking to decouple American mineral production from slave labor then?
Slave labor is completely illegal in the United States, has been since the 19th century. And so the domestic sourcing in the United States is preferable over activities like you're describing in the Congo.
But yeah, obviously. But we are reliant, as you and I talked about in our first round of questioning, we are heavily reliant on supply chains that is shot through with slave labor and child labor in China, in the Congo, elsewhere. So my question is, what are you doing to decouple us from those supply chains? You won't support a ban on child labor, so what do you propose then?
This was the purpose of the interagency working group that I chaired. This is the entire thrust of the report that we issued earlier this month, is how do we increase the reliable sourcing of these materials. I think Dr. Juergen makes an excellent point about refining as well, to decouple, again, our reliance on sources that involve practices that are abhorrent to us.
Well, all I can say is, I don't know why it makes any sense to be shutting down critical mineral supply chains in this country, shutting down mines in this country, mandating further reliance on China and other overseas supply chains that are dependent on slave labor and child labor, while workers in our country are facing the loss of their jobs. I think it's just crazy, to be honest with you. I think it's just crazy. And Mr. Chairman, I have to say in conclusion, you may not like my questions, but I'm going to keep asking them. I made a commitment to the people of my state. I'm going to come right here. I'm going to be a bulldog. I'm going to ask the questions, and you can interrupt me as much as you want, cut me off, take my time away, but I promise you I'm not going to stop.
I would never do. Let me just tell you one thing. I agree with what you're saying. I just don't like the way you say it. How's that?
That's your right, but you know
We
what?
have a different.
I'm going to keep on keeping on.
Here's the thing. We all agree. You know, if you'd have been able to be here, and I know because of other committee assignments, but we were going through all of these things. That was the only thing I got frustrated on. So with that being said, there's not a person here that doesn't understand. We are absolutely upset. This whole thing about the Congo, I've been speaking to people down there. It's horrible what's going on. They want to change. They're going to have our help. And I agree with you. We shouldn't accept any child labor. I'm on the bill, I think. But with all that being said, we've got to do more permitting here. We've got to do, because basically we're allowing the EV, our whole EV dependency now, moving in that market quicker than what we can ever supply. And my whole reason to basically fight this administration is because I do not want to become dependent on our, basically, our transportation mode on an unreliable supply chain. That's what will happen. I've waited for, I was old enough in '74, we talked about that, oil embargo. I had to wait in line to buy gas to go to work. I don't want to wait in line to buy a battery from China to go to work. So I agree, we're on the same path, I think. We just have a different way of approaching it, that's all. And that, I respect that. Okay, with that, we have Professor Daines is going to explain to us exactly why we're messed up.
I've been promoted to professor.
Well, I'm going to, because I see you got a whole chart.
Tell you
I
what.
feel like I'm in a classroom now.
Yeah, so I get to geek out from my old days of being a chemical engineer here today. So, Chairman Manchin, thank you. Behind me is the U.S. Geological Survey's most recent graph showing the United States mineral import reliance. And this comes right out of the report of the U.S. Department of Interior, U.S. Geological Survey here, which is a really good report. I want everyone to take note of the highlighted portions that show, and I recognize it's an eye chart, but just to summarize it, that look at everywhere it's highlighted, that's got Russia or China. So the yellow is China, the orange is Russia. Of the 65 minerals on that list, we rely on China or Russia for over half of them. That should be a wake-up call for all of us. I remember, as I think everybody here is old enough, remember 1973, and we were going through, you know, you think about the Jewish religious calendar, we just came through Yom Kippur. the War of Yom Kippur, 1973, was a wake-up call to the world as it exposed the dependencies we had and kind of our single point of failure in the Middle East for oil. And of course, the Gulf of Hormuz, it was blockaded. We saw oil prices skyrocket. And in fact, those skyrocketing oil prices contributed to some of the inflationary pressures we saw that by 1981, a 30-year fixed mortgage was 18.6%. What I'm concerned about is we are headed down a path where we could repeat the same mistakes that were made back in the 70s as we look forward in terms of a more renewable type economy, more dependencies on electricity as supply for cars and so forth, that China and Russia become the OPEC of critical minerals. Simply put, we need to be mining more in the U.S. because what came out of the war of 1973, the War of Yom Kippur, was a rallying cry. We need energy independence. And we've been working on that now in the United States to develop more made in America oil, gas, and coal to ensure we are decoupled from dependencies in terms of kind of the ultimate supply chain failure, and that is an energy supply chain failure. This could be another situation that faces us if we don't find ways to bring more of these critical mineral the mining operations to the United States or to friendly countries. Deputy Secretary Boudreaux, the Department of the Interior recently released their recommendations to reform mining. In it, you suggested raising taxes, lengthening the permitting process, withdrawing more land from development, and slapping a new royalty on mining operations. All these recommendations are not going to make it easier to mine domestically. It will make it harder. They will drive us further in a dependence on China and Russia rather than promoting and incentivizing U.S. mineral independence. Mr. Boudreaux, do you agree that your recent recommendations are a step backward for mineral independence? And why would the department think that creating more costs and more regulatory hurdles for mining projects is the best idea when we are faced with the reality of Chinese and Russian mineral dominance?
So the goal of the report and the recommendations in the report is to combat exactly the situation that your chart depicts. In order to do that, there are fundamental things that have to be addressed. One is the legacy and history of conflict that the mining activities in the United States have posed for communities across the United States. Some of that is reflected in the over 500,000 abandoned hard rock mines that dot the United States, especially in the American West. So any discussion about royalties reflected in the report is meant to help address that. It's the same thing that we do with mine reclamation for the coal industry. It's the same thing we do with decommissioning and reclamation with the oil and gas industry. And so, again, that is to build a sustainable system for mining in the United States that has social license.
Mr. Compton, one of the great things about democracy...
He disagrees with me on some of that.
Well, I was going to say, one of the great things about democracy is we allow to have different points of view. And by the way, Mr. Boudreaux, I have great respect for you and grateful what you do in Interior, and I'm a supporter of you and your nomination and glad you're where you're at. But I think we can also respectfully disagree. And Mr. Compton, you may have a differing view, but what do you think?
He and I have that same relationship, by the way.
Yeah, with all due respect to the Deputy Secretary, I do disagree with him on the outcome or the proposed outcomes in the working group's report. And, unfortunately, I think it's just consistent with what we have seen from the administration. We talk a really good game about securing our mineral supply chains, beginning with the President's America Supply Chains Executive Order within a month of coming into office. All too often, what we're seeing with actions on the ground, they are decidedly anti-mining. And, I get where the Deputy Secretary is coming from in changing the dynamic on how mining is conducted here. But we've done that. The industry has been committed for a long time to early and proactive engagement with stakeholders, communities, tribes. As a matter of fact, I think the federal government, through their formal consultation process, can learn a lot from the mining industry. But we're never going to, as much as we are all for early engagement, we're never going to deconflict every mineral project. There are those out there that are just simply opposed to mining. It came up earlier, yes in my backyard. Well, we got an awful lot of no in my backyard. Mm-hmm. And so the fact is that all the early engagement, we're all for that, but we're not going to deconflict this. We are still going to be facing litigation, and that's why I look forward to additional permitting reforms from this committee that can address that.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I know that, but just on the litigation form, I'll make a final comment. And
I'm just glad Senator Hawley's not here.
You hit another topic here that I don't have time to continue the dialogue here, which I think has been thoughtful. But we've been trying to get a copper mine permitted in Montana for 30 years. And they've been through wonderful EIS. I used to be an old Procter & Gamble manager, and we used to make shampoo and mouthwash and toothpaste. It was lather, rinse, repeat. It's lather, rinse, repeat right now on the litigation because we're in the Ninth Circuit Court. And I think I know the chairman's been passionate as I am about permitting reform, and it's badly needed.
We're getting there.
But it's necessary, but I would argue not sufficient without litigation reform and a change and just better balance in our courts, particularly start with the Ninth Circuit.
Senator, before you came, before you were here, 'cause I know you had other assignments, right. But we talked about that. And I brought the committee up to state that both our Republican staff and our Democrat staff have been working very close, and we're getting agreement, and then we know where our challenges are, and we're going to try to overcome those to have something I think that both sides will be very pleased with, and some permitting reform. We're very hopeful for that.
Well, and I just want to commend.
And what you're saying right now, judicial reform is something that's very top priority.
It is, because it becomes that Article 3 jumps in here and suddenly undercuts everything we've done. I mean, 30 years with state-of-the-art mining practices in Montana.
You've got the 9th District, I've got the 4th. You got the 9th Circuit, I got the 4th.
Yeah, we call it the 9th Circus out there in Montana, Mr. Chairman. So anyway, thank you.
Let me just say this to all of you. I think you know how interesting this is and how essential it is for our country to move forward. I can always, I can talk about the passion that people have for where we are going and what we need for our country to be more self-reliant and not dependent on foreign supply chains. And I'm sorry for sometimes the dialogue and everything. I can't speak to that. I can try to control it the best I can. But with that being said, we all have the same, I think, commitment and intent, both Democrats and Republicans, to be more self-reliant, not to be dependent, and basically make sure we can do what we can do. We can't ask other countries to do what we won't do for ourselves. That is the biggest challenge that we have. And hopefully we can get permit reform that Secretary Boudreaux, that'll help your agency give a clear pathway forward to what needs to be done and why we're behind you to get it done. And hopefully we can make that change. But with that being said, I have a letter from the American Critical Minerals Association as well as a statement from the National Mining Association addressed to this committee. I'd like to enter into the record these two pieces of testimony without objection. I don't see any and I don't hear any. So both organizations commend the bipartisan efforts of the committee, recommend some common sense solutions such as permitting reform, and highlight the need to act with urgency to address critical mineral supply chain. You all have been grateful and very helpful today, and we're very grateful for that, and I appreciate it. I know you made efforts to be here, and I appreciate that more than you know. So the members are going to have until the close of business tomorrow to submit additional questions for the record. And with that, meeting is adjourned.